Now, this is the first edition with the papers being shown on this screen. First edition of the Khoodeelaar TV channel, worldwide, world exclusive diagnosis of Fleet Street. Now, if you look at the kind of detail, roadmap out of lockdown, but it will take until July. Now, what they're saying there is that the Daily Mail and Boris Johnson are equally idiotic because they're contradicting even the statements there. If the lockdown is to be ended, then why should it take until July? Because that suggests that they are not sure what they are talking about. And this is because they're not treating the lockdown or the virus as seriously as they should. And they're making party political, shallow party political exploitation of whatever bit of good news they can pump in. And there is no way, that the evidence justifies, the evidence does not justify this criminal propaganda along the line that the lockdown should be kind of removed or eased. We shall go back to the lockdown lies by the Daily Mail a little bit later. Now, this is on page 12 and page 13 of the Daily Mail today, Wednesday, the 17th of February 2021, which has got a two-page spread, mainly banner-headed as kidnapped. And it says, it is by Richard K., editor-at-large, an Arabian princess imprisoned by her father in a Dubai villa, who then smuggles a shocking video plea to the world in a heart-stopping tale that exposes the sordid underbelly of the celebrity influencers' playground. The celebrity influencers are, of course, the Western criminals, wrongly called celebrity, but the criminals are quite happy to prostitute themselves on behalf of various kind of pimps that pay them huge sums of money, and they debauch themselves, and they, as I said, prostitute themselves and pimp one another and pimp for one another in Dubai. So this is the princess. What I have said about the prostitutes, wrongly called celebrities, influencers, these prostitutes are complicit. The prostitutes are complicit in the crimes against humanity that are perpetrated and are perpetuated right across the so-called Gulf states. And Dubai is probably, in terms of the numbers of people being lured to the den called Dubai, is the biggest one in terms of the numbers. But other places, other kind of emirate states are as corrupt and as much dense of debauchery by the debauchery being indulged in by the so-called celebrity influencers and criminals disguised as celebrities and pimped by the pimps from across the UK and the USA. And a significant number of the prostitutes are in operation in Dubai and in neighboring kind of states, emirate states, who come from the subcontinent, numerically mostly from the Republic of India. Large numbers come from Pakistan and significant numbers come from other states, including Sri Lanka and Bangladesh and Nepal. So all of those evidence, all of those facts constitute the background to the behavior of this, whatever it is called, it's the man who's kidnapped his daughter. This reminds of the 1980s, I think, ITV and a documentary about the death of a princess in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi regime murdered this princess, so-called, allegedly for her anti-Islamic kind of lifestyle. But there is nothing Islamic in murdering her or murdering any other woman for their lifestyle. The Islamic kind of Sharia, which is used by these murderers, doesn't allow for these crimes. Women cannot be murdered or deprived of universal human rights by anyone, by any regime, which does not observe in every aspect of their conduct and life, society, the injunctions of Islam. And there is no society. There is no society, including the Saudi ones, that actually observes the principles of Islam. So until all the principles of Islam are in practice, nobody can be given a death sentence, because that will be in isolation of the rest of society, which is actively anti-Islamic. And we don't believe that the Daily Mail is bothered about that. The Daily Mail is bothered about the fact that a lazy piece can be spread, a 2-page spread, as a shocking item, and it is actually And the fact that the Indians are colluding with the Dubai regime is admitted in this piece by Richard Kay in the Daily Mail. First column and end of first column on page 12. It says, looking pale and frightened, Latifa, the princess, describes the dramatic moment when the yacht on which she made her failed escape attempt, skippered by a hired French adventurer, was boarded by Indian troops after 8 days at sea. I kept saying, you can't take me back, she recalled. I want asylum and we are in international waters. You can't kidnap me. They were just on a mission and they were given orders. Latifa describes how she fought with two Emirati officers and bit one of them on the arm before her hands were zip tied and she was later tranquilized to keep her quiet. So the Indian army was the kidnapping army, kidnapping a Dubai princess. And the Indian army in that role was behaving as the army and the kind of goons of the violator of the human rights of this young woman. And this Richard Kess is desperate to start a new life in the West, away from the stifling conventions of Dubai, where all women must obey a man. She embarked on an escape that had all the ingredients of a Hollywood blockbuster. So the more appropriate word or phrase would be an Indian Bollywood blockbuster. And the emphasis is on man, but it's not on human rights, it's on a man. So he's the biggest khiladi in Dubai. And Hollywood or Bollywood are not likely to do a blockbuster on her anytime soon. So this criminal must be treated as a criminal against humanity and human rights. Mary Robinson is a madam and aiding and abetting the imprisonment and kidnapping of this child. And the Daily Mail, we're going back to the Daily Mail's lies about the pandemic. It says terrible cost of a slow return to normality. Boris Johnson bridles at suggestions that he is constantly moving the goalposts of a lifting lockdown. What other conclusion can be drawn? Millions of Britons will be horrified by the Mail's grim revelation that life will not approach normality until at least July. If the vaccination drive continues apace, all over 50s, almost everyone at risk of dying will have had at least one jab by the end of March. Deaths and hospitalizations should plummet long before then. Yet, under the Prime Minister's current thinking, it will be another 4 months before the country regains its cherished freedoms with some social distancing. What planet do these morons exist on? Because the word cherished before freedoms suggests that freedoms outside of the period of lockdowns do exist. They don't. The lifestyle of most people is a brainwashed, zombified lifestyle. It's not freedom. Because to have freedom, there must exist secure, reliable, and permanent and continuous, assured availability of rights, services, and access to facilities, including health care. At the point of need, they don't. And they contradictorily concede. Of course, Boris should not rush. This lockdown has to be the last. Once the jabs prevent the majority getting seriously ill, extreme caution will be unjustifiable. The collateral cost will be gargantuan, more bankrupt businesses, and the pandemic of lost jobs, poverty, and mental health problems. NHS waiting lists could hit a record 10 million, with many patients requiring life-saving treatment. On Monday, Boris Johnson unveils his roadmap back to our old lives. He must focus on closing the yawning disconnect between the vaccine treatment triumph and the sluggish pace of consigning lockdown to history. Now that is stupid. They're writing it emotionally. They're not writing it scientifically, evidentially. And that is the difference. Even New Zealand, which was kind of praised for having got rid of the virus, has now begun to start reimposing lockdowns because the virus has returned, although it is a return in terms of numbers, involving small numbers of people getting infected. But the point is that even when a country has completely almost obliterated the virus, it still has to reimpose the lockdown. And that is because of the evidence, not because of the emotion. And here is the Daily Mail, part of the Fleet Street brigade that wants lockdown to be ended. Emotionally talking about the cost to business and completely neglecting to mention the cost to lives. That is what the Daily Mail is doing. In the Daily Mail on page 17, Sarah Bain, the wife of the liar Michael Gove, she has got her column headline, "Feel invisible as a middle-aged woman?" Question mark. Her answer is, just pretend to be a man. That is again stupid. How can a woman of whatever age pretend to be a man? There is a cartoon by someone called Paul Thomas on the Daily Mail. It's supposed to be funny about the steps Brenda and her family, the royal family, are taking. And that includes a go at Oprah Winfrey doing an interview shortly with Harry and Meghan. And there is a continuing a piece about Caroline Flack, based on her video statement in a documentary year after her tragic death. And there is a piece corruptly called Daily Mail Campaign, which says, "End the cladding scandal." It's about the Grenfell Towers. Why is it corrupt? Why am I calling it corrupt? This is the piece. about the Grenfell cladding. It's corrupt because it is avoiding, it's avoiding and diverting attention from the role of the local council being the Kensington and Chelsea Council controlled by the Conservatives. And the fact that the Daily Mail is calling it "End the Cladding Scandal" is to do with the fact that it doesn't want the Conservatives to politically lose credibility for neglecting the human rights and the legal rights for safety deserved by the people who were massacred on 17th of June 2017. So they're talking about the business, not about the humanity. They're not talking about the council's failure and the council's negligence towards the people that were massacred. The failure and the negligence are crucial factors that played a role in creating the massacre. We said about the London Fire Brigade and the emergency services, so-called. We have said before, not in this program, but in earlier editions and in our online posts during the last 3 years, that the 72 people that were massacred could have survived, could have lived, could have been alive if the emergency services had sprayed water on the building at a scale that would have overwhelmed the fire completely. Why? Because the physical location of the building, the Grenfell Tower, is ideal for the building to have been showered with water, flooded with water from all 4 directions by aircraft being applied to carry water and flood the building with water. And how would that save the people? Because the fire, it was shown live on television, raged for hours. So the fire raged for hours, in which these people were murdered, massacred, and no attempt was made to flood the building from all sides with water carried in military helicopters. There are more than 4 military helicopters available. And if 10 of them had been applied and filled with water and used to flood the building would have been completely wet and the fire would have been out. And most of the people, if not all, would have lived. But the Daily Mail is not talking about that at all, nor is any other part of Fleet Street talking about that. As far as we know, no organization, no individual other than the Khoodeelaar campaign has been making this statement for 3 years. So the Daily Mail is saying, Inquiry Chairman Sir Martin Moore-Bick has already concluded that the flammable cladding was the main reason for the rapid spread of the West London fire in 2017, which claimed 72 lives. The inquiry continues, but this is a lie because Martin Moore-Bick and the Daily Mail are not talking about the failure by the emergency services to flood the building, which was ablaze, with water to the point that the water would have completely dampened the fire and most of the lives would have been saved. So that fact that a decision was made not to flood the building with water. I mean, helicopters could have been scrambled and military aircraft could have been scrambled to carry water that would have been many times the size and the volume of the building. And there would have been no obstruction physically from any side because the building, the Grenfell Tower, stood free of any other building or obstructions nearby, clearly making it very easy and possible for military emergency aircraft, including emergency helicopters, to be scrambled, carrying water and flooding the building and getting rid of the fire, which killed the 72 people. So that decision to deny that service to the people being killed by the fire rain was the massacre. And that is not mentioned either directly or by implication in anything that Martin Moore-Bick has said, or the so-called campaigning Daily Mail has said. The Daily Mail is campaigning for the property profit and property business and property profiteering interests of those owners of properties that are concerned about cladding in their buildings and properties. Without the massacre having taken place, that kind of concern would have been perfectly valid and legitimate and absolutely scientifically, evidentially overdue. But that's not the reason why the Daily Mail is concerned about the cladding and the secret. The secret is the test. Secret is not the policy by the local council to allow the negligent and corrupt and dangerous use of the contracts and the entry of the contract and the operation of the contract with the crooks and criminals that actually applied the cladding. The Daily Mail's concern is the test that was not genuine and not is allowed to be treated on the record as having been rigorous and according to the legal obligations. Because the contents of the report or the finding of that test falsely claimed that the building was safe. That is the secret. But that's not the whole truth at all. It's only part of the evidence, part of the symptom of the agenda to let the people die. So that was the decision that constitutes the massacre. So the Daily Mail is being corrupt to the core. And we shall be talking more about the Daily Mail's corruption. Now we're moving back to the corruption by the Financial Times, painting the war criminal, the leader of the genocide regime in Burma that massacred and genocided the Muslim people because of their being Muslim, Rohingyas. And for the last 4 calendar years, since the genocide became public knowledge outside of Burma, Aung San Suu Kyi has been justifying the genocide by denying that it took place and by refusing to admit that the Rohingyas are as much part of Burma as anybody else. And her defense against the trial, kind of one stage of the trial for her role in the genocide, includes the kind of defiant denial of responsibility for the genocide. And because of the genocide trial that has been kind of lined up against her, she has failed to have any positive headlines in the West until this coup. So this coup by the Burmese gives her an excuse that she is the victim. She is the victim of the military. She is not. She is a contributor to the policy to commit genocide and mass murder of the Muslims because she visited the various foreign countries. And her line was to deny that the massacre of the Muslim Rohingyas had taken place. There never was any evidence that the Burmese governments, series of governments, whether it's called military or so-called non-military, had admitted the rights of the Rohingyas as citizens of Burma. And that goes back decades of denial. So the Financial Times is being corrupt and is lying as part of the genocide denier and genocide perpetrator Aung San Suu Kyi. And the fact that this woman who is in post at the Financial Times as the so-called editor of the Financial Times comes from Lebanon. She was born in the Lebanon. Makes no difference, it seems. She is colluding with the propaganda for the genocidist criminal Aung San Suu Kyi. That is the same as the genocidal anti-Muslim massacreists across the West. And she's saying in this piece, the Financial Times piece, a demonstrator holds up a placard of deposed Myanmar leader Aung San Suu Kyi in Yangon yesterday during protests against this month's military coup. That is a complete lie. The fact that there was a coup is a staged coup. It is a staged coup staged by Aung San Suu Kyi and her military colluders in order to deflect attention from the demand that she be tried at the Hague, the International Court, for crimes against humanity. Because that has been the result has been to divert attention from that, which this Financial Times propaganda reinforces. Now, the Financial Times also has got a platform piece about Twitter. And again, it's a lazy item about India tightening the grip on social media platforms. What is happening in India affecting hundreds of millions of people's rights and affecting the prospect of removing or increasing poverty in India to hundreds of millions of people is not a tiny matter. But the piece on page 10, we shall see the actual contents of the page 10 of the Financial Times today. And it's saying the social media site navigates standoff with New Delhi over request to block accounts. It says technology and it says regulation. But it's not regulation at all. It's democracy and human rights that are being kind of obstructed and denied and suppressed by the Modi regime in India. And the reason is that the platform has been used to express support for the campaigners against Modi's kind of poverty creating denials of rights to farmers. Because farmers in India had been enjoying subsidy from the central government. And Modi is removing the subsidy, thus plunging people, hundreds of millions of people, into poverty. That is the reason why there have been farmers' protests. And this picture is saying, the caption is saying that these demonstrators in New Delhi showing support yesterday for activists arrested in connection with the farmers' protests. Now, this picture is by Altaf Kadri, who is working for the Associated Press of the USA. Altaf Kadri is, of course, based in India, is an Indian working for the Associated Press. And I say Altaf Kadri is rare because most of the kind of bylines and credits are given to non-Muslims in India. There are 300 million Muslims in India, but they are not treated as 300 million Muslims. They are treated as much smaller number of people, and they are denied rights throughout the year, every year. And the farmers' protest is not being treated in that way because the farmers are not, majority of the farmers are not Muslims. So there is an anti-Muslim kind of agenda going on. And of course, it's something that we shall be continuing to update on in due course. So let's see the Altaf Kadri picture on the farmers' protest and the demonstration in support of the farmers arrested by the Modi regime. This is on page 10 of the Financial Times today. And we shall be talking about the picture more. We shall be talking more about the picture in due course in the future, but let's see we are putting on our Twitter platform at 12:43 hours GMT that picture from the Financial Times. And the photo credit is, of course, given to Altaf Qadri. And we shall focus on, zero in, or close in on the credit. Given to Altaf Qadri and AP. And the demonstrators are carrying banners, including a banner or banners that demand the dropping of all charges against a lawyer. But this is really seriously in breach of all the international treaties and conventions and agreements and statements that India is signed up to. But there is no similar comment about any of those breaches. And what the Financial Times is saying is really not about the breaches of those treaty obligations that India is under, but it is part of a propaganda push by the Twitter and other networks that have been subjected to the ban and restrictions by the Modi regime. When we talked about the kidnapping by the Dubai so-called royal head of Dubai of one of his 30 children by 6 different women, Princess Latifa. We referred to her kind of video report message of pleading for help as written by Richard Kay, the editor at large at the Daily Mail today, Wednesday, the 17th of February 2021. We included a reference to the piece by Princess Latifa. describing that the Indian army kidnapped her and handed her over back to Dubai to be tortured and tormented and kept in solitary isolation. It exposes the Indian regime hailed for decades by the crooks in the media in the West as the world's biggest democracy, as being the beneficiary fascist regime benefiting from the propaganda engineered for itself by the Western mainstream media, including Fleet Street, including the BBC. If the man can be kidnapped, if the man can be allowed to have his daughter kidnapped by the Indian army, what is the Indian army doing there? It's working as the openly mercenary army, doing the crime in return for huge payments by the Dubai criminal. And it also exposes in a big way the racism of the Western feminists and the prostitution of the Western feminists like Mary Robinson. She prostituted herself in return for gifts and bribes from Dubai's so-called ruler. And she lied against the victim of that criminal. And she lied and said that Princess Latifa was mentally troubled and was receiving mental treatment. What did Alexander Solzhenitsyn say about the Stalin regime and the Gulag? And the same thing happened in Czechoslovakia when Alexander Dubček was treated for his mental problems represented in his descent to the fascistic regime in Czechoslovakia by being sent to work in a farm, agricultural land. Solzhenitsyn's diaries while on the Gulag and while in detention in Siberia and Dubček's tortures are the same or similar to the treatment being meted out to Princess Latifa by Dubai ruler, with the active armed collusion and service by the prostitute regime of Narendra Modi. Where is the outcry in Fleet Street? Where is the outcry on the BBC? Where is the outcry on the Guardian? There is no outcry. And this is why we assert strictly evidentially and factually that Fleet Street is a prostitute organization, as is the majority of the Western media. So it has no moral basis. It has no moral, evidential, factual ground to claim to be morally better than its alleged kind of deniers of freedom. Because the Fleet Street and the Western media wrongly, factually, untruthfully labels, brands campaigners in Muslim countries, campaigners for human rights, international human rights, in Muslim countries or Muslim majority countries, as being less rigorous, less morally active, less ethically superior as compared to the Western campaigners, so-called. But that's the opposite of the truth. The conditions in which Princess Latifa has been kept and being tortured by her so-called own father have been neglected by the West. And the fact that a president of Ireland, ex-president of Ireland, who propelled her own image as the biggest achievement for women's rights that must have been achieved in the last 2000 years or so, that she prostituted herself and her services to the agenda of the Dubai ruler, speaks for itself and condemns her to be condemned forever for complicity with the violation of human rights of this Princess Latifa. And Mary Robinson and all her promoters, other racist Western feminist women who have been wrongly claiming that Muslim women are less active or less interested in women's rights than their Western counterparts. Those racist Western feminists must be seen for the racist feminist Western criminals that they are. They have no right, absolutely no right, to berate, to deprive Muslim women of the recognition that the Muslim women, as personified by Princess Latifa now, deserve. Imagine a Western, let's say, take an example, the current example of a personality. Imagine Greta Thunberg of Sweden being insulted by anyone. She would be correctly, rightfully featured as the victim of whoever would have insulted her. And what Princess Latifa has been undergoing for years, and what thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of women in these Gulf states have been undergoing, suffering, have been thousands of times worse. And yet, those Arab Muslim women have been denied the support in the West. What is the secret? Because they're all the Western media and all the Western feminists are carrying out the agenda of the ruler of Dubai, or the carrying out the agenda as typified in the behavior of the kidnapper, the so-called ruler of Dubai. And this is a crisis. This is a crisis that the United Nations current Secretary General, Antonio the gutless Guterres, has been colluding with by staying silent about. And that is only tip of the iceberg. In the Gulf states, where many people, women from countries with poverty levels, high levels, including India, are either trafficked to work there or are otherwise migrants seeking kind of economic kind of help for their own families and themselves. Human rights of these women are not recognized. And these women are raped, sexually abused, tortured, murdered, massacred, without any mention of these in Fleet Street, by the American or Western European mainstream media, or indeed in the social media, including by most of the Twitter account holders. So when the Financial Times says on page 10 of today's edition that Twitter is feeling the heat as India closes in on dissent, you have to notice the headline, the words. It's India is the ruler, the dominant factor here. Instead of being identified on the facts as the defier, as the breaker of the rules, and as the committer of the perpetrator of the series of crimes against humanity, human rights, against the founding and currently active principles and aims of the United Nations. So there is a list of people who have been identified as contributing to this piece. One is Siddhartha Venkatarama Krishnan. Sounds like a South Indian name. And Amy Kazmin, New Delhi, Benjamin Parkin in Mumbai, and Hannah Murphy in San Francisco. And it starts, and Siddhartha Venkataram Krishnan is shown as being in London. Now, this piece, first paragraph says, Chaudhry Sukhram Singh Yadav, a second-generation member of parliament for India's opposition Samajwadi Party, has a limited online presence. His Twitter account, created last year, boasts fewer than 250 followers. But the suspension of his account last week reflected the dilemma facing Twitter as it navigates a deepening standoff with New Delhi. Yadav's was one of hundreds of accounts blocked at the request of the Indian government after he used a controversial hashtag in support of widespread farmers' protest. Now, we shall come to more details about this Siddhartha Venkatarama Krishnan for a reason that will be obvious in the piece when we come to it. We shall be posting right now as we do the broadcast this instantaneously a close-up of this paragraph in our Twitter account. We shall be doing this in this this edition, this Twitter account, Khoodeelaar Twitter account about the Financial Times today. And it is these names we are focusing on. Close up of the FT piece about India regime Now, this is the piece that the Financial Times is doing. This is not the first time in the last kind of weeks. Financial Times is running critical pieces about the Modi regime. The FT piece is, of course, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. Yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 columns. Well, let's say 4 columns. So the 4 columns, including the highlighting captions, is quite a wide kind of piece in terms of accommodating it on the Twitter post. So we shall do that in 2 parts. That picture of the piece, a picture of the image of the piece. And then we shall continue with the contents of the text, the copy of the text. Anyone who has been watching the nearest commentary to the Indian government that can be found in any kind of cohesive form should look at the contents of the so-called blockbusters. The Bombay blockbusters are mainly the Tamil and Telugu and Kannada language films that make references to the Indian government. But those references are completely incomplete, incorrect, misleading, and are in the main done to promote the image of the Modi regime. Essentially, the blockbuster films and film producers avoid going into the depth of the corruption, criminality, and hatred that the Modi-fronted regime is. But when they do make references to the kind of corruption elsewhere in society, for example, in the main areas of life in society in India that, according to the films, the goons and the thugs and the dons, the killadis, dominate. The role of the central government is hardly ever mentioned, let alone examined. And we shall, of course, contextually go into details of the scripts and the stories and the storylines and the dialogue, etc., in other parts of this channel, in this broadcasting channel. But for the purposes of the Financial Times piece today, Twitter feels the heat as India closes in on descent. That's the Financial Times today. That's the headline. And that's the picture by Altaf Kadri working for the Associated Press of America. This is the picture he filed from Delhi yesterday. And the caption reads, demonstrators in New Delhi showing support yesterday for activists arrested in connection with the farmers' protests. Now, I have added a few words in there for clarity in the broadcast here. But essentially, the protesters are not telling in their protests anything like the whole truth, because they can't. There are so many violations by the Modi regime of the international treaty obligations, even Indian penal code and other kind of laws that cannot be listed in one single demonstration or in a series of demonstrations either. So I was talking about the Supreme Court. What the Indian blockbuster films do is avoid the role of the Supreme Court. Now, anyone who wants to know about fascist regime that lasts longer than the Nazi regime lasted needs to understand what happened in Stalin's Russia, what happens in Mao Zedong's China. In the last decade of Mao Zedong's China, they had in Peking a thing called "This is Radio Peking." That's how, and it was so powerful, the transmission was so powerfully done that anywhere in the world, the noise level was higher than the noise level of the local network of broadcasters. So it was a radio network, radio transmission, the broadcast. And it declared itself, "This is Radio Peking." And the Radio Peking carried regular lies, packs of lies. Now, no one knows how many people got murdered under Mao's last 10 years. But there was no accounting. And the reason there was no accounting is because the Western media, contrary to the pretension that it was for freedom and human rights and all the rest of it, stayed silent. And it wasn't just silence in the 1970s after Mao Zedong died, but it has been silent since Mao Zedong's death. But a study of the investigations, however sketchy they were, that were made by outside countries, including in India, because India, next door to China as a big population country, has got a direct defense and other security interests. So therefore, there are numerically many more studies about China done in India and done through the collaboration of India and Indian investigators about China than in any other country. So the Chinese and the Russian Stalin kind of regime and the regimes in Saudi Arabia and in other parts of the Emirates, including Dubai, are needed, absolutely, essentially needed prerequisites to the understanding of what is going on in India today. Because there are dozens and dozens and dozens of layers and stages and kind of levels of pretext and pretense to justify the denial of democratic rights to the ordinary people. And that's what the Financial Times is not saying. Remember what we are saying. Our diagnosis is that this item is mainly promoting the interests of the likes of the Twitter business. And it is not talking about the denial of rights by the Modi regime, contradicting and violating, which is violating the obligations that India is under as part of the country being a signatory to international treaties.